There are a number of ways in which IFC projects, World Bank projects, look at the participation of women in processes, be it through assessment of environmental social impacts, be it through engagement of communities, and then in the CAO context as well, when we try through our dispute resolution arm to engage companies and affected communities in processes to address issues of concern. There's a general acknowledgement that the participation of women is important, but perhaps we can spend a little bit of time of why that is. Why do we need women at the table in these processes? And then talk a little bit about the challenges and how do we get there.
When you look at it on the ground in Libya, the reason I felt it was so important is because women integrally, I think, feel more for the society because they put more work into the society. So now that we have currently a civil war, you'll find it's women who are the ones who will go to the quote unquote enemy and give them blankets and food and things like that, because there is a recognition that you are part of one society. There is a recognition that you will need to compromise, that there is justice that needs to be had. And because, this may sound bad, but because women have the least to gain from conflict, and they have the most to lose. So they're not in the armies that are getting $5 million because they took over the major highway. They're not in the armies that are taking over the airport and getting, sources in and out. They're at home, having 21-hour electricity cuts, not having any water, not being able to find baby food. So for them, conflict is not beneficial. And so they'll be the first people who look at different avenues and different ways to resolve it and to get out of their comfort zone and say, okay, what can we do? So I think women's participation is extremely essential in those regards. And that's without kind of the structural advantages that women bring. So their networks and their credibility and all of that. That's not even regarding that. It's simply saying that when we talk about conflict, and my sister always says, war goes on because people want it to. People are making money. And it makes the most sense that, if you're talking about a company, the company has benefit of, acting in that environment the way it does. And I think women force people to take more responsibility for their actions. And they force people to come to the table in a different way than men do. So I think their participation is extremely important. Anybody else? There are two questions in there, I think, that are important. First, what can the international community do to ensure that there are more women at the table? But second, how do we overcome barriers that we think are limited culturally, locally, right? I have a problem when people tell me that women's rights cannot be achieved because of cultural barriers, only because everything else seems to be achievable except for the participation of women. You want to have an oil deal, it'll be done. There's no cultural barrier. You will sit down, you'll eat on the floor, but when it comes to women's rights, like, no, we can't. We just can't. There's cultural. So I think that it's a huge excuse. And if I think they felt that it were more economically advantageous, they'd have more women at the table. So a lot of it is about perception, and a lot of it is about statistics. A lot of it is about research and getting that to the people who are in charge and saying, you need to force them to bring women to the table, because particularly in negotiation and mediation, and we've had it, a counterpart from my region actually said to me, well, we can't force women to be there because then the men won't show up. And I'm like, I promise you, if you show up and you're talking to somebody about resolving the conflict, the men will come. Like, they're going to have to come. So start the conversation with women. Start the conversation with whoever is willing to show up to better their community, and stop using culture as an excuse. I think from the international community's perspective, at least what I've seen in Libya, is it's much easier to reach out to people that we feel are more accessible. So it could be these organized CSOs. It could also be, for example, militias. We say, well, this guy's actually the one in charge. He's the one with the gun. He should sit at the table. Or this guy's the head of this organization, and it's a combination of 14. But ultimately, those people are not representative. So that militia, you might sit down with them and they'll go to the community and somebody else will pick up the arms, right? So you need that foundational support, and women provide that in much higher numbers.
The question on why should women be at the table, I mean, for all those reasons and more, certainly in the context that we work, it's very practical. If healthcare is an issue, women need to be part of the solution, because they're the ones who are going to be picking up the crisis and the issue and deciding, well, what would work in that situation. So I think it's also a very practical and pragmatic approach. They hold up half the sky. They need to be part of the solutions. And I think that for us is about sustainability.
For me, I think it makes the most sense to work with people you wouldn't normally work with, only because I mean, we can all sit in this room and agree women are important, et cetera, et cetera. But nothing will happen unless we get people who completely disagree with us into this room and figure out why they disagree with us and what exactly their point of contention is and how we can, marry our two perceptions of women's roles together so that we can slowly begin to advance. Because particularly in Islam, or in any faith, I think, or in any community, to be honest, and the United States is an example of a country that has a distinction between church and state, and yet women's rights and roles have taken decades and centuries to come, and we're still not even equal, right? So I think that we have to be realistic that it's not going to happen overnight. We're not going to wake up and say, okay, so now the women will walk into the Buddhist, monks area, or now we're going to have a Muslim imam, female imam, who will lead the whole Islamic ummah. I think we have to be a bit realistic that it's going to take time, and we have to be strategic. So what we've recommended, at least to other mediating bodies, in particular when it comes to conflict, is that first they make a requirement of their own teams to have a certain percentage of women. Because, and I'll give one quick story about Libya, when we had a meeting on transitional justice and reconciliation, one of the members of the international community asked the Libyan counterpart, "Where are your women?" And he looked back laughing and said, "Well, where are yours?" Because there were none in the UN team. So it has to be led by example. And then following that, on purpose, go to communities, make it media public that you are seeking out the women. Because if they see these international communities going into these small cities looking for the women, they'll start bringing the women to the table. If you start saying you are not a credible source in this, you're not a credible partner, you're not legitimate, you do not represent your population, they will force themselves to represent the population. And that's statistically worked. So I think it comes from both sides. I think you're right. It is about practicality. And unfortunately, the most practical thing is to go to whatever is already organized, or whoever is easiest for us to reach, especially if we don't speak the language or know the culture, etc. But I do think if we're going to be honest and realistic and we want approaches to last longer than the meeting that we're at, we need to go into the communities and we need to say, okay, so we're purposely seeking out the women. And there are teachers who are women. So you could go into one school and meet with 60 women. You could go into one local trading area for like spice trading and you can meet with 30 women. And people will hear about that. You need to do it once or twice in a community and make it very clear in your mediation with the men, if you bring women at this table, we will take this more seriously, not just you. And they will bring some in. And in the beginning, they might be seat fillers. They really might. It's like a quota in a parliament. In the beginning, they might be seat fillers, but then they'll start talking. And then when they start talking, the men can't get them to be quiet again because they know they have a voice. And then they show other women that they can have a voice. So I think it changes the dynamic drastically. That would be my recommendation.